might think that I'm suffering from a little bit of allergy, ragweed or something, but let me just say it has nothing to do with allergies. Last night I was thinking, I'm getting rid of these season tickets. I've had it. And then. So I think I overdid it a little bit, which I know better. I know better than doing. You know, it's that time of year when all the kids have gone back to school, and, you know, we started getting these phone calls from our kids trying to make ready for the grandkids going to school, and, you know, they needed this and they needed that. And this is Maddock, he was our newest. Now we have Selma Rose that was born in January, but Maddock lives down in Austin. Stephanie put him in school, and she just went and bought him a lunch box. And Sarah and Stephanie's the mother of Maddock, they were talking, and Sarah said, Stephanie, you can't just use that lunch box. You've got to go to, was it Pier 1 or Pottery Barn? You got to go to Pottery Barn. You got to get this designer lunch box. You just can't get any lunch box. You know, I mean, this is his first day of school. And, you know, and she'd gone and checked about, you know, where you drop him off and how you get in the line and who picks him up and who his teacher is and what class he's going to be in. It reminded me of this story about this fifth grader who they just moved to this community, and family was anxious about him starting school. And they'd done all the preparation stuff. They'd gotten the pencil boxes and the lunch box and the paper and the crayons, and they had gotten the instructions that on the day that school starts, there'll be a list, and you go up on the list. He'll need to go up on the list and find his name, and then look across and find what room he's going to be in and his teacher's name. And so they were all set, and so, you know, he's dropped off at school. He gets in the line. He's, you know, this long line. Everybody's got their pencil boxes and their crayons and their bag. And so he steps out of line and goes up to the list, and he goes through each list, and then he goes back and gets in line, and his face is red, and his eyes are full of tears. And the kid that's right next to him says, well, whose class are you in? And he sort of shrugs and wipes his sniffling nose, and he said, well, didn't you see your name on the list? And he says, I'm not on any of those lists. The bell rings, the door opens, and all these kids with all their lunch pails and pencil boxes and pads start filing in. And this kid that's talking to the kid that his name's not on the list says to him, I'll stay with you to help you find your class. I think I know who can help us. And we're talking today about packing the house, and we're talking about being welcoming. In the NIV, the word that Amy read in the scripture lesson was accept one another. And the Revised Standard Version, it uses the word welcome. Welcome one another. We're talking about hospitality today. And when you think about hospitality, you think about welcome, it reminds me of the very beginning of the gospel story. When you read the Gospel of Luke, you remember that it starts with this narrative, this nativity narrative, and this unnamed, unidentified person tells the Holy Family, Joseph and Mary, as they go to Bethlehem to register, Mary is going into labor, and Jesus has to be born, and there's no place for them, right? You remember that? And so what's the thing that we say every Christmas? This might have been a better Christmas sermon, I don't know, but there's no room. There was no room for Jesus in the inn. And we all have those kinds of experiences when we feel like we're on the outside or we're left out or it's awkward. I was in a checkout line. Sometimes, you know, I go to Walmart and I try to get out of there quickly, and I go through the checkout and the self-serve, the, you know, lane, and, you know, as soon as you get up to the register, it says, warning, credit card only. Well, I was in one of those lines one day, and I'd had a bunch of stuff, and the shop was crowded, the store was crowded, and I'd waited in line, the music was playing, And I get up there, and I've got my stuff segmented out with that little stick, keep them getting mixed up with the person in front of me or behind me. It's finally my turn, and they start scanning my stuff. And I was going to write a check that day, and the cashier says, it's cash only. And before then, the music was playing, it was kind of everybody was talking, and all of a sudden when this guy says that in kind of that gruff voice, it was like you could hear a pin drop. And I don't remember why I was writing a check, probably left my billfold in the truck or something. And now everybody's looking at you, And you feel like that you've committed the unpardonable sin. And there's a host of angels coming to throw you in jail or in hell. And the security guards come, and finally the manager comes over and he takes the receipt. He says, come here, let me help you. But that feeling, you know what I'm talking about? That feeling of not being in, not being a part, being on the outside. You know the story of our nephew, Carl, that he accepted Christ. He didn't grow up in church. He's been around us. We've stayed connected with him. His father died when he was 3, and we've tried to stay connected with him, to him, through all of these years. He graduated from college, got a job with Cargill in Arkansas, moved to Fayetteville 3 or 4 months ago, and just decided to go to church on June the 21st. Accepted, encountered Christ, called us and said, I got a new father on Father's Day. We had a baptism service here. Well, he decides that he needs to step his game up. He's been reading the Bible like crazy. It's kind of been hard to keep up with him, actually. And he is just eating it up. And so he decides it's time to go to small group. And so last week he goes to small group. There's about 20 going to this small group experience. There was a leader. And so when you came in, everybody got a card, got a 3x5 card. And on the card was the name of a hymn. And the leader said, there's 3 other people that have the same hymn on their card that you have. So here's what you do. You walk around this room and you hum this hymn that's on your card, and you find the other 3 people that are humming the same hymn, and then you make connection. Carl said, I didn't grow up in church. I don't know hymns. He said, thankfully, I recognized my hymn. It was Amazing Grace, but he said, I didn't know what the tune was, and so I'm just faking it, he's saying. I'm walking around the room going, until I hear this young lady, who I'm thinking she's humming Amazing Grace. That's got to be it. And I think he thinks she's pretty good looking too, but that was a different part of the story. And so he said, I just started following. Everywhere she went, I followed her, and I started humming what she was humming. And I think she's humming Amazing Grace. And finally, somebody walks up to her and says, Amazing Grace. He said, I knew I was in. I would say about that probably wasn't that smart of that group leader, putting hymns on a card, particularly for people who didn't grow up in the church. Because what we're talking about, and in the RSV, they use the word, and this passage, and actually this dialogue goes from chapter 14 of the book of Romans all the way through 15. And some translations use the word accept. Some use receive. I like what the RSV says, welcome. Welcome. And I've said this to you before, when Paul writes, the way he writes is like a college professor. He's like a thesis, like he states the problem. Here's the problem. And in the first part of Romans, he states what the problem is. The problem is sin. And we've all fallen short of the glory of God. So that's the problem. And he says, now here's the solution. The solution, as he points out, he said the first Adam, if you remember Romans, brought sin into the world. The second Adam, which is Jesus, has now brought grace to us. And so the answer to the first problem is Jesus. And so he lays out the solution to the problem. So what? We all know that kind of stuff in our heart and our head, but then he goes on and says, but how do you live it? How do you live it? What's the application? What's the implication of what we're trying to say to you about Jesus, what's the implication of your life? What kind of weight, responsibility does that place on you? And Paul gives us some very practical insight in part of the way we live this life in Christ. And he says we welcome. I didn't give you the whole load. I just had Amy read the first 9 verses. Let me read you verse 7 of chapter 15 of the book of Romans. Would that be helpful to you? Go like this. Yes, it would. Listen to what it says, verse 7 of chapter 15. Welcome one another just as Christ welcomed you for the glory of God. Welcome one another, therefore, just as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. How did Christ welcome you? If we had time to interview everybody in this room, I'm sure that most of our stories would go something like this. You know, I really didn't have much of an idea about God. Maybe I grew up in the church and the church kind of exposed me to this idea about Jesus and God, or maybe I didn't grow up in the church like Carl. And so I didn't have much idea about God, but something began to draw me. Something began to move me. Something began to speak to me. I felt this pull, this something. It's a friend said something, or I heard something on the radio, or some way, and we call that as Methodists, we call that prevenient grace, is Christ brings us to the place that we know the essence of Jesus is he takes us who have been strangers to him and he makes us a friend to God. Jesus Christ made it possible for us to have a friendship with God. And how did he do that? He died on the cross. He took all of our mistakes, all of our wrongs, all of our sin, and he died for us. Paul says, welcome one another as Christ has welcomed us to the glory of God. Welcome as Christ welcomed. How did Christ welcome? How does Christ welcome? He welcomes the child. We had a baptism of an infant. We gave third graders Bibles. Jesus welcomed a paralyzed man that was lowered by his friends down through the roof because they were desperate for this man to be healed. Jesus welcomed a thief on the cross as he was hanging there dying for us. Jesus welcomed this thief that was next to him. Jesus welcomed the shepherds and the king. Jesus welcomed the mother who gives nourishment to her children, the father who provides protection. Jesus welcomed the lame, the lepers. Jesus welcomed the one who climbed up a sycamore tree so he could get a better look at this guy that he had heard of, Jesus. And Jesus tells him to get down. Jesus welcomed the soldier whose daughter was dying. Jesus welcomes those who fish with nets for a living. Jesus welcomes tax collectors who are looked at with disdain in the culture. Paul says we are to welcome as Christ welcomed. Lewis Smedes has been an influence in my life. He was a Christian counselor. He's written some great books about forgiveness and the Christian life. And we think about people who feel like they're on the outside. We think about those verses like Matthew 7:7, ask and you will find, seek, ask and you will be given, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open. Lewis Smedes says this: why do we call grace amazing? Grace is amazing because it works against the grain of common sense. Hard-nosed common sense will tell you that you are too wrong to meet the standards of a holy God. Pardoning grace, forgiving grace, tells you that you're all right in spite of so much in you that you know is wrong. Realistic common sense tells you that you are too weak, too harassed, too human to change for the better. Grace gives you the power, gives you power to send you on the way to being a better person. It's the grace of God that calls us into a friendship with Jesus. And sometimes that starts when somebody that has skin on invites us to come to church, that calls us and says, I want to pray with you, that takes an interest in us and offers us hospitality. And sometimes there's a risk in that, isn't there? There is. This morning we used this illustration. I walked up and said, hi, my name's Adrian. What's your name?
Jim.
Jim, how long have you been going to church here? Are you new here?
Seems like it.
Seems like it. Are you? This your first Sunday?
No, 18 years.
18 years. Sometimes we're afraid to talk to somebody because we're afraid that maybe they've been going here a long time and we just didn't know it. We'd never met them before. There's a bit of a risk to be hospitable. But there's nothing wrong if we meet somebody, they've been coming for a long time, maybe a little embarrassing, but not to greet them, I think, would be sin. I've been studying recently themes regarding atonement, and that's the work that Jesus did on the cross. And I've been reading a book by Scott McKnight called A Community Called Atonement. And you may not understand atonement. I'm trying to learn more about it. It's what Jesus did for us, but I know what it looks like, and I want to close by sharing a story that I read out of that book with Scott McKnight. And this is about hospitality and about atonement and welcoming people, listen, welcoming people as Jesus has welcomed us. In my years in the ER, I saw Jesus daily doing his kingdom work through a group of his followers. It was a true expression of the church. She's talking about being in the ER. One day stands out of all the others and left me radically changed forever. It was the day I saw Jesus face to face. Give us hearts as servants was the song they were singing as I left the church service that morning, heading off for my second 12-hour shift in a row. Weekends in the ER are absolutely brutal. I was physically and emotionally spent as I walked up to the employee entrance. The sound of ambulances and the approaching medical helicopter were telltale signs that I would literally hit the ground running. Don, can you lock down room 15? Yelled my charge nurse as I crawled up to the nurse's station. When someone asks for a lockdown, it usually is a psychiatric or combative case. 2 security guards stood outside the room, biceps flexing like bouncers anticipating a drunken brawl. My eyes rolled as I walked past them into the room to set it up. The mass medics arrived with the man, and I'm going to call him Mr. N is what the book said, Mr. N. He was strapped and restrained to a cart, the hallway cleared with heads turning away in disgust. They were disgusted at the smell surrounding them. They entered the room, and I could see Mr. N. His feet hung over the edge of the cart, covered with plastic bags tightly wrapped around his ankles. The ER doctor quickly examined Mr. N. while we settled him in. The medics rattled off their findings in the background with Mr. N. mumbling in harmony right along with them. The smell was overpowering as they uncovered his swollen, mold-encrusted feet. After tucking him in and taking his vital signs, I left the room to tend to my other 10 patients in waiting. Returning to the nurse's station, I overheard the other nurses and the techs arguing over who would take Mr. N as their patient. In addition to the usual lab work and tests, the doctor had ordered a shower, complete with a betadine foot scrub, antibiotic ointment, and a non-adherent wrap. The charge nurse looked in my direction. Don, will you please take Mr. N? Please? You don't have to do the foot scrub, just give him the sponge in the shower. I agreed and made my way to gather the supplies and waited for the security guard to open the hazmat shower. As I waited with Mr. N, the numbness of my business was interrupted by an overwhelming sadness. I watched Mr. N restlessly mumbling incoherently to himself through his scruff of a beard and stash. His eyes were hidden behind his ratted, curly, shoulder-length mane. This poor shell of a man had no one to tell him that they loved him. I wondered about his past and what had brought him to this hopeless, empty place. No one in the ER that day really looked at him, and no one wanted to touch him. They wanted to ignore him and his broken life. But as much as I tried, I could not. I was drawn to him. The smirking security guards helped me walk him to the shower. As we entered the shower room, I set out the shampoo, soaps, towels, like it was a five-star hotel. I felt in my heart that for at least 10 minutes, this forgotten man would be treated as a king. I thought that for these 10 minutes, he would see the love of Jesus. I sat down, the foot sponge, and decided that I would do the betadine foot scrub by myself as soon as his shower was finished. I called the stockroom for 2 large basins and a chair. When Mr. N had finished his shower, I pulled back the curtain and walked him to the throne of warm blankets, and the 2 basins sat on the floor. As I knelt at his feet, my heart broke and my stomach turned as I gently picked up his swollen, rotted feet. Most of his nails were blackened, curled over the top of his toes. The skin was rough, broken, and oozing with pus. Tears streamed down my face with my gloved hands tenderly sponging the brown soap over his wounded feet. The room was quiet as the once mocking security guards started to help by handing me towels. As I patted the last foot dry, I looked up, and for the first time, Mr. N's eyes looked into mine. For that moment, he was alert, aware, and weeping as he quietly said, "Thank you." In that moment, I was the one seeing Jesus. He was there all along, right where he said he would be. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? When was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison or visited you? And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least who are members of my family, you did it to me." Matthew 25. Hospitality is what Jesus does to us and through us to others. A phone call, a touch, a notice, a word, a text, a hi, learning somebody's name, making people feel at home. We see Jesus. We experience him, and so do others see him as well. I invite you to respond as the Holy Spirit leads you. There is